it's another interview about growing up punk. So if you're a fan of 90s punk rock or even into the early 2000s, which I'm assuming you are if you're listening to the show, it's kind of mostly what we talk about around here, and you're also a fan of YouTube, then there's a good chance that your path, your YouTube viewing path, has crossed paths with this guy. His name is Sam Cavero, and that may not immediately jump out to you, but his YouTube channel, 90s Punk Rock Covers, might be something that you go, yeah, I've seen that before. He's a guy playing his guitar, playing 90s punk rock covers on YouTube. They look fantastic. They sound even better. Anyway, on this episode, our guest today is that man, Sam Cavero. Aaron had the chance to chat with him, and this is what they had to say. Actually, first, before we get into that, this is a thing I could have probably edited out, but I didn't. I'll drop our social media information. Of course, you can follow us on Twitter at Growing Punk Pod. You can find us on Instagram at Growing Up Punk. You can find Aaron on Instagram at Aaron Grew Up Punk, and you can find myself, David, on Instagram and Twitter at David Growing Up. Anyway, all of that stuff is now out of the way. This is Aaron's interview with Sam Cavero, aka 90s Punk Rock Covers on YouTube.
Could you just maybe kind of introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about maybe how you got started doing covers and YouTube, and maybe a little bit about that?
Sure. Okay, so my name is Samuel Cavero. I run a YouTube channel called 90s Punk Rock Covers. And basically, I've had this idea for the longest time. I mean, I've been playing guitar since I was probably 15. And I always wanted to do something to sort of pay homage to a lot of the bands that I grew up listening to, especially in the pop punk genre. And so I got into video and photography about 10 years ago. And ever since then, I've always had the idea I wanted to do like a channel and just do videos and covers. But, you know, for A or B reason, I never got around to do it until I kind of set myself a goal and said, you know, this year I have to do it. Doesn't matter how it looks. I just got to throw it out there and see what happens. So the first video that I ever shot was a No Use for a Name cover, Fatal Flu, actually.
Awesome.
And yeah, it's been, I've had the channel for about a little bit over 2 years now. Still growing, you know, it's not as easy as people think, but I've been getting a lot of good feedback from other people who appreciate this genre of music. And they're very positive, and people seem to really, really enjoy the videos and so forth. So basically, the channel is that it's, like I said, paying homage to a lot of the bands that I grew up with, and also do a little bit of gear reviews because I'm a huge guitar collector and gearhead. So I try to mix it up, throw in a couple of reviews or just my personal opinion on certain gear that I like. So hopefully in the future, I will be featuring more of that. But for now, I'm really having a lot of fun doing the covers and so forth. So it's going really great.
Yeah, and I think that's what really stood out about your channel. You know, there's a lot of other, you know, punk cover channels that show up on my feed that I watch, but there was something about yours with, you know, each one having a different guitar, and you put on the video kind of the specs of the guitar and just that little extra thing that kind of, you know, I don't necessarily know a lot about guitars, but I know there's a lot of people, you know, into music that kind of nerd out about that. And so, you know, it's just an extra way for you to kind of stand out and just makes the videos really fun to watch. Like every time I look or watch them, I don't really know anything about the guitar, but there's something that's just kind of mesmerizing about it, and just kind of looking at it and adds that extra bit of, you know, kind of effect to the video. So that's awesome. How long have you been playing guitar? What made you kind of want to start collecting them and that kind of stuff?
I think I've always had like a little bit of OCD, and I've always, since I was a kid, I've always liked collecting things. Like it started with toys, and then it moved into comic books, and eventually once I started playing guitar, like I said, around 15, obviously I was still a 15-year-old kid. I didn't really have a lot of money to buy a lot of stuff. But once I got my first guitar in '99, which actually made a video of it, about my top 5 guitars that I've ever owned. My first guitar was first real guitar was a '99 Gibson Les Paul, which I saved a lot of money to buy. and I was working, part-time job because I was still in high school, and it was once I got the guitar, something clicked. I'm like, oh man, I mean, I love the instruments. I love how they look, how they feel. I mean, I love playing them. And, ever since then, I just kind of got the itch to buy more stuff. And with time, and I buy and sell a lot of things. But yeah, that's kind of like how the whole thing started. Just the collecting part of it, at least.
Yeah, and was there a band that influenced you to go for the Les Paul? Because that's like my all-time favorite guitar too,
Yeah.
looks-wise, just because that's what so many punk bands use. So
Yeah. I mean, the Les Paul to me, it's my guitar. Like I gravitate towards picking a Les Paul every time I play guitar or just make a video, because they're in punk rock. I mean, there's a lot of players that have played with the Les Paul. So particularly, I guess the first person I would say that influenced me to pick up Les Paul was Slash from Guns N' Roses. Obviously,
Yeah.
he's like one of my all-time guitar heroes. So even though it's not punk rock, but he's the guy that I saw when I was a kid, and I saw him playing that Les Paul. I was like, oh man, I gotta have the guitar. I have to one day. So that kind of influenced me. But I mean, other guitar players, like, I mean, Tom DeLonge from Blink played Les Paul for a couple of years. And there's Tony Sly from No Use for a Name. He played a really nice Les Paul custom that I always fantasize about, a white one. So yeah, it's that guitar for punk rock. I think it's like a perfect combination. You put in a Marshall amp, and you have like a really good foundation of like a 90s punk tone in your hands.
Yeah. Yeah, so you mentioned Guns N' Roses. Is that, kind of what you first got into music, or was that kind of some of your earlier influences? Or can you talk a bit about kind of what maybe what some of your earlier memories of music were that kind of first intrigued you?
Sure. Well, Guns N' Roses came a little bit after. The first kind of encounter with music, I would think it would be the Beatles. I had an uncle who passed away a few years ago. He was a very eclectic person. He liked to read a lot. He read comics. He liked all these different types of music. And I remember I was probably 5 or 6 at the most, and he purchased me, or he bought me a LP from the Beatles. It was like the greatest hits. I forgot which album it was, but it was like some type of greatest hits album. And I remember him telling me, like, you might be too young to like appreciate this music, but as you get older, you're probably gonna like really enjoy this. And so I'm like, okay. So I remember playing that LP and hearing, one of those classic Beatles songs like "Love Me Do" or "Hard Day's Night" or whatever. And I was like, at that moment, I something clicked in my head. I'm like, man, this is great music. And I was a kid, I was 5, 6, and from that point on, like I always gravitated towards like pop side of music, I guess, like melodic, and
Yeah.
that helped me sort of understand melodies and composition and singing. And so from that point on, I think that's kind of like how I started my journey into music. And then obviously as I grew older, Guns N' Roses was obviously a big influence for me. Even though I can't play like Slash or anything like that, but as far as a guitar player, obviously somebody I always look up to. And then I sort of got into a little bit of heavy metal in my early teenage years. And after that, and I got into punk rock, probably, during high school, stuff like that.
And was there something about punk that stood out, different than metal? Like for myself, I'm the opposite, where I got into punk, and then that kind of, got me into heavier stuff. So it's interesting that for you is kind of the opposite. Was there something about a punk that stood out that metal didn't offer you?
That's a good question. I guess, around that time, obviously you're growing up, you have a lot of hormones and things changing in your mind, as you're turning 15, 16, and so forth. I guess at the time I don't know why I just gravitated towards metal first. I don't know. It must have been like a phase I was going through or something. I was actually born in Caracas, Venezuela, in South America.
Yeah, that's cool.
And yeah, and we moved to the States probably '93. And so I guess that transition from leaving your home country and kind of starting a new life somewhere else, it's sort of it had an impact on me as a person and growing up and everything. So adapting to a new culture. Even when I lived in Venezuela, we had a lot of like American influence, like in TV and music. Like it was very attainable to get those type of media in my country. Um, but I guess just the change, cultural change, adapting to a new thing, making new friends or whatever. So maybe metal was kind of like an escape for me, like just a little bit of rage. Perhaps I was going through, I don't know, but I could really relate to that type of music in my middle school years, all the way to like probably freshman year of high school when I really got into more punk rock. And that was probably also some type of change emotionally that I was going through. So perhaps I could relate, or at that time I was able to relate more into punk rock than metal, and I sort of like just drifted off metal and got into punk.
And how did you find punk music? Like in the '90s, what did you have access to the internet then, or were you going to to local shows or touring, big time touring bands that were coming through, or kind of what was that transition like?
Well, I mean, I live in Miami, so our scene, it's not the biggest scene as in other cities, but we would get big bands at the time. I mean, we always do still, but the scene itself wasn't as as it was like maybe in California or New York or whatever, where it was just more accessible, I guess. We have a lot of different cultures here in Miami, especially Latin communities and stuff like that. So it's not as popular, I guess, as in other parts of the country. But my first recollection of listening to punk rock, it has to be Green Day.
Awesome.
Listening to Basket Case. Well, actually watching the video on MTV when we could watch videos on MTV, right?
Yeah.
Watching Basket Case for the first time, I was like, wow, this is like, it reminded me again, kind of like talking back to the Beatles' first experience. It was almost like that. I felt that same connection as far as like the melody and just the raw of the guitar, Billy Joel's guitar, the tone, the drumming, everything was just like, it blew my mind. I was like, what is this? I need to hear this. I need to buy this CD, whatever. I got to do whatever I had to take to buy this album, And so, yeah, Green Day, definitely my first real punk influence, even though at that time they were already being called posters or whatever, like
right.
sellouts, because in the 90s, but whatever you want to say about that band, I mean, they changed a lot of lives as far as like kids in that age, growing up in that age, that listen to them. They definitely made a big impact in music and punk rock. So they're one of the greatest bands of all time, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I'm similar. They were one of the first ones. Actually, I think I found a cassette tape on the playground when I was in grade 6. Had no idea what it was, but I put it on and it had that album on. And I don't even know how long it took me to even know who it was, but yeah, every time now that I put Dookie on, it just takes me back to that. And yeah, such a great influential band.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that, because it's one of those albums that they age so well. Like there's some other bands that I kind of go back to, like from the 90s era, and like I listen to it, I'm like, all right, this is good. It didn't have the same impact to me now as an older person as when I was young, and when I listen to Green Day, it actually, like you said, it just takes me back. Like it actually just, and I feel the same kind of emotion as when I first heard it.
Yeah.
It's one of those albums that no matter how old you are, I think you're always going to enjoy it, and it doesn't get old.
Yeah, and I think there's something special about that with punk music, like with nostalgia. I don't hear people saying, "Oh, the first time I heard, Britney Spears or whatever," that it creates some like emotion. They might be like, "Oh yeah, it takes me back to middle school or whatever," but it doesn't. It wasn't life changing, and it didn't affect the way they dressed and who they hung out with, and so that's what 100%. I love. That's why I love talking about punk music and people that grew up on it, because it was such a lifestyle switch, right? Like, or at least for myself, it affected the way I dressed and who I wanted to hang out with, and all that kind of stuff. So did you ever end up getting to see Green Day live?
I did, and it took forever. Actually, I actually saw them in a Warped Tour in, I think it was 2000 or 1999. I think awesome. They did a whole Warped Tour, and I saw them for the first time there. I was like, oh man, I remember they actually, even because in those type of festivals they always have like a set time for the bands, like they have to play like 45 minutes,
right? And
then the other band comes in, because there's so many bands playing at the same time. And I remember, they played actually like an hour, and I think NoFX was gonna be following them, and then they were just just looking at them like, these guys, man, like I, I I guess they could do whatever they want at that point. I mean, they were big enough, and they had never done a world tour, so they were just like letting them extend the set list for another 25 minutes or whatever. And yeah, so it was cool. It was a really good experience watching them live for the first time.
And what album cycle would have that been on for them?
So
99.
2000, that must have been after Warning, maybe.
Oh, okay.
I think so. Yeah, something like that.
Oh, do you have
Or Nimrod.
do you have any quick thoughts on kind of that transition for them from Nimrod to Warning?
I mean, I at that time, obviously, when you're still young and you're kind of learning music, and you probably don't you maybe I didn't take it the right way. I was like, I don't like the sound. It's totally different than what I'm used to, and this and that. And I think that's just because I wasn't mature enough. Now, as I got older, I got back into that album, and I think they have some really amazing songs. And the songwriting of Billy Joel has always been, top notch to me. And you can really see how the band started maturing after that point. And it's a really great album now. But back then, obviously, I didn't take it too well. I was like, I kind of stopped listening to him for a while.
Yeah, and I find that interesting too. With as we age and go back and realize, okay, especially for someone like yourself that is a musician, you can kind of appreciate that more. When there's time and you go back and be like, okay, like I kind of get what they were trying to do. They're trying to switch it up or whatever.
Right.
But yeah, I'm the same at that time. I was just like, oh man, what is this? But now when I listen back to it, yeah, like I love that album. So
yeah, it's a great album. It's just yeah, it's just as you age, I guess you become wiser. I guess, I don't know. But you start appreciating a lot of things that you kind of took for granted when you were younger. Definitely, 100%.
Yeah. So you've shared a few different stories with Beatles and Guns N' Roses and Green Day. And at what point would you say that you knew that music was your thing, where it was, more of just, this is what I like to listen to kind of in my time versus, this is consuming my life. I'm always thinking about it. I need to have it every day.
I guess probably when I picked up the guitar and I started learning, basic songs and chords and things like that. I found I've always been sort of like I want to say an artsy kid. I used to draw when I was younger, and like I said, I'm into photography and video, and music has always been a huge part of me as a person, in my life. And once I picked up the guitar and I started learning some of these songs, like Green Day songs, Blink songs, and things like that, I always said, if I don't make it in a band or anything like that, at least I want to be able to learn the instrument, play it, and always have that around me, growing up. So I guess around that time when I picked up the guitar, that's when I knew music was definitely a big part of my life.
Yeah. There's something really neat about when you add that other element of learning how to play the songs. I always feel for people that love music, but they can't sing a note, they can't play any instrument. Because it was the same for me when I started, playing drums and then guitar, realizing like, oh, I can play these songs or play along to it. It just added that extra element of feeling, connected to that music.
Of course, 100%.
So what was it like? Like you kind of mentioned a bit about the scene and bands coming up. Did you have, a group of friends that you hung out with that had similar tastes, or were you kind of on your own with that, or what was that like?
No, I had a group of friends that were into the same music as I was. One of my best friends, actually, we sort of grew up listening to the same pretty much bands throughout high school and things like that. I mean, I remember him buying a CD that I wanted and be like, oh, let me borrow it for a week and I'll lend you this CD that I have that you probably like. And we would exchange CDs like once in a while, so that was always fun. And every time I, heard about a new band, like by reading the thank you notes on the CD sleeves or whatever, I'd be like, hey, we gotta check out this band, It's like, oh, awesome, whatever. Well, I remember I don't know if in your town they had this stuff, but in here in Miami we had something called Specs or Blockbuster Music. That was like in the mid '90s, I guess, mid to late '90s. And it was basically like a Blockbuster of just music CDs, right?
Oh wow.
And they had a little booth where you could actually pick a CD from the store, and the guy will open it and play for you, and you can just put your headphones on and listen to the CD. And
Yeah.
it was awesome. I used to love that. And we would spend hours just like, I think there was like a limit of like 3 CDs per person or whatever. So we would go, both of us, and we get like 6 CDs that we want to listen to, like different bands, and like, oh man, this is awesome. And that's how we learned a lot of the bands, because the internet wasn't as it is nowadays. Obviously, we had internet, but it wasn't. You didn't really find like a lot of websites that talked about this stuff or whatever. So yeah, I mean, I had a group of friends that were into that. As a matter of fact, two of them, we started a band together in high school. That was my first band. So yeah, I've always had a few friends who've always been into punk rock.
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I'm the same. Once you had it, again, added that extra element when you had somebody else that kind of understood it, and yeah, just wanted to pour over the liner notes and just dive into it.
Mhm.
Again, I don't think that
Yeah.
happens with a lot of different genres of music. Maybe that's just more of an underground music kind of thing, but just
Could
makes me
be, yeah.
thankful to have those experiences. And so, do you still have
Yeah.
all your CDs, or are you a vinyl collector? Or?
No, I had like a really big collection of CDs at one point. And I actually think I mentioned it to you on a DM one time we were speaking, that somebody broke into my car and they stole my whole album of CDs that I had there. I had like over 100 CDs on a big ass like booklet thing we used to put the CDs in.
Yeah.
And yeah, they stole that. And after that, I'm like, you know what? And that was around the time where like MP3s were like kind of like hot. And I'm like, you know what? I'm just gonna start like downloading stuff and streaming stuff or whatever. And I sort of stopped collecting CDs. I do have a couple of vinyls that I like of like some of my favorite albums, but I'm not that much of a collector of vinyl. I mean, I'm already neck deep in the guitars and stuff like that I'm
Right.
collecting, that I don't want to add another another thing to my list, But yeah, I enjoy listening to vinyls.
Yeah, man, that's such a classic story of getting robbed of CDs. Like, I hear
Yeah,
that all
man.
the time. There's actually somebody else
Sucks.
this week I was talking to online, and they said, like, just, had all their CDs and DVDs, and which is funny because now if you had a book of CDs in your car and someone broke in, they would be like, well, I'm not hauling that thing around. It's useless.
I know, exactly.
But yeah, like when I look through my CDs, it's like, man, like I spend like, well, especially up in Canada, like CDs were so expensive, like 25 bucks for a CD. So it's
Wow.
crazy to think that, hundreds of CDs, like how many thousands of dollars I've spent, and now
Yeah,
they're worth,
yeah. I mean, it was heartbreaking. Let me just say that. I mean, I was mourning for for a few weeks, man. I was just devastated.
Yeah. Well, at least now we have, streaming things. If that was never a thing, you'd have to rebuy all
Right.
that music, whereas now, $10 a month and you get whatever you want. So
Yeah. I mean, I know there's a lot of pros and cons about the streaming services and the way they pay musicians and things like that, which I'm not gonna get into because I'm not in that market. But it's for convenience, as a convenience for us. I mean, it's so awesome. Like I love that. Every time I'm like, oh, okay, I want to listen to this band like on the fly. I could just go and just search for that and have this whole discography of the band. Like, that's amazing. Before obviously it was a little bit different, but yeah, I mean, I totally enjoy the streaming services. I actually use Spotify, and that works pretty well for me.
yeah. I often think just like, man, my 16-year-old mind would just be blown thinking I could have access, to any
Yeah.
music I wanted. But at the same time, I'm so thankful I found music the way I did. Like you said, looking through liner notes and going to shows and sharing it with your friends. Like now it's just put on a playlist or whatever, and you have access to so much that you don't really gravitate towards, the artist as much. So,
Right. Yeah, I mean, there was definitely a more of a connection back then with actually owning a physical CD, a copy of the CD. You spend the time reading those liner notes and looking at the artwork. Nowadays, it's just everything's so fast. It's just information, which kind of sucks in a way, but it's also good because if you just want to listen to music right off the bat, then you have that in the tip of your fingers now. But yeah, definitely I miss that nostalgia of like holding that CD and getting all excited and reading all those liner notes, like you said. Yeah, it's definitely different, but yeah, it's good memories at least.
Yeah. So what would you say has, kept you coming back to this type of music after all these years? Like, why do you think you haven't grown out of that phase, or maybe you have, but I take it that, this is still a big part of your life. So what do you kind of equate that to?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I guess just that foundation of the music and how going back to just finding out at that young age and being there for you, like when moments of happiness, moments of sadness, heartbreaks, things like that. I could always fall back in some of those lyrics from those bands from the 90s, for example, which is basically where the time that I grew up. And I can always go back to that and relive those moments, and so maybe that's why it's like like that nostalgia that's never gonna like go away, I guess.
Yeah.
That it's like people who grew up in the 60s or in the 70s. They idolize Led Zeppelin and those type of bands, Hendrix and things like that, which I can relate. Like they're amazing musicians. You play a Led Zeppelin song, I'm like, oh wow, it sounds awesome. They were ahead of their time, but it doesn't do anything for me. Like it doesn't move me, it doesn't speak to me. A lot of the lyrics, especially from like a band that I haven't mentioned, Face to Face. They're probably one of my top 5 favorite bands of all time.
Hmm.
And a lot of the lyrics had a lot of power that maybe at the time when I was so young I didn't really quite understand. But as I grew older, like they really resonated in me. And despite or not whether I understood them 100% when I was so young, they kind of stayed in the back of my head.
Hmm.
And that's a kind of a band that I admire so much. And it came, or I discovered the band at a time in my life where I really needed kind of like a message.
Yeah.
And it can mean to different people, it can mean different things. But to me at that time, that band really marked me. And I guess, yeah, going back to your question, just that nostalgia of good music, man. It was really good music at the time. In the 90s, there were so many good bands coming out. And despite what people say about like, the Ramones and older bands like that, which also were amazing, but the 90s had like something, there was a different flavor in the music and the lyrics and the riffs, and everything was just completely changed the game. You know what I mean? And that's why you see bands nowadays trying to mimic that sound. And some of them are good. A lot of the younger bands, they try to kind of keep that pop punk alive and stuff like that. But it's not the same. It doesn't have the same, authority as a lot of the bands in the 90s had.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So you mentioned top 5 albums with Face to Face. What else, or top bands? What else would be in those top 5?
Um, wow, it's another good question because there's so many great bands.
Yeah,
But
it's hard to choose.
I know, and it just just because of I guess of how I discovered them basically. I guess Green Day will be one. Blink 182, Face to Face, Screeching Weasel, it's another big band that I really enjoyed.
Yeah.
And probably Rancid. Those 5 bands really made a big impact in my life growing up.
Yeah, and what would be your favorite album from each one of those bands?
Green Day, definitely Dookie. Blink 182, that's tough, but I guess Dude Ranch, because it was like the album that I listened to the most around that time.
Yeah.
Face to Face, the first one, Don't Turn Away, definitely. Rancid and Out Come the Wolves, just because it was, like I said, it was that punk explosion in the 90s, and that album was so good, like from beginning to end. It was just amazing. And Screeching Weasel, probably Kill the Musicians, which wasn't a real album. It was more like a collection of like B-sides and unreleased songs and things like that. And that was the first album that I listened from them. And yeah, it blew my mind too. I was like, oh man, this is cool, man. This is punk, but like melodic, but also like a little bit different than what I'm used to, like lyrically. And I really like that album a lot.
Yeah, those are hard choices because all those bands have quite a discography to choose from.
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure.
So
I
have
mean,
you?
it's
Sorry, go
hard to
ahead.
choose.
Yeah.
No, yeah, I'm saying it's really hard to choose one, but I think those five are probably my top five.
And it's also interesting too hearing, some especially with those bands that have been around for a long time and have lots of albums, that our favorite albums aren't necessarily always, their best one or the one that sounds the best or the most popular, right? Like
Hmm.
sometimes it's just the ones that had the most memories for us or the one that, kind of got us into that. So it's just always kind of interesting to hear that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure.
And have you seen all of those bands live, or what would be some of your top live show experiences over the years?
I have seen out of those five, I've seen all of them except Screeching Weasel because I think they broke up sometime in the '90s and then they went back
Right.
together and they broke up again. They're kind of like a chaotic group of musicians, but yeah, I've never got to see them live, unfortunately. But if we're gonna talk about memorable shows, I will say probably Warped Tour '97, which was my first Warped Tour ever, and that thing was loaded with like bands. It was like MXPX, No Use for a Name, the Mighty Mighty Bosstones, Blink 182, Jesus, Less Than Jake,
Yeah.
just an amazing array of bands. I think that's Sublime play. I might have played.
Hmm.
I think they were
That's
still
crazy.
around. Yeah. I think even I mean they're not really that good, but Limp Bizkit, like right when because they're from Florida and like they were not known at the time. I remember
Right.
them seeing them like who are these guys, you know? But and then they blew up like years later.
Yeah.
But yeah, 97 Warped Tour was like one of the best times of my life. Like it was perfect.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't even know when we started getting Warp Tour up here. Like, it was only close to where I live once,
Hmm.
maybe twice, but
Oh wow.
definitely not in those, in the 90s. So, yeah,
Yeah.
I love hearing about that. It's crazy. I can't imagine, seeing a lineup like that. So,
Yeah, that I mean, it was the pretty much like all the hot bands of the mid to late '90s all in one show, like in one venue. It was amazing. It was a real big fish was there too, which I love. It's another ska band that I really
yep.
like. Yeah, it was amazing. Just a great show.
So,
Super great memories.
do you still try get to live shows? Like, do many bands still come through there, or is that kind of a thing that you just kind of leave in the past, or do you still try to get out when you can?
No, yeah, I do. As a matter of fact, I was in the Face to Face and Lagwagon show a few weeks ago,
Man.
which was awesome. And yeah, I try to go to shows as much as I can. Obviously, not as much as I would like to, because obviously sometimes life gets in the way. But I try to go out to catch bands as often as I can. Yeah, I love to watch them play live, and since I'm a gearhead too, I like to see what they play, and
Yeah.
it also gives me ideas to when I do my videos that you mentioned earlier, as far as like what I choose or whatever. I put a lot of work and thought when every time I do a cover, I try to do a little bit of research on the band and what instruments they were playing around the time that song was released or that album was released, for example. And since I'm lucky or fortunate enough to have a lot of like different guitars and things like that, I can always kind of like pick and choose what the tone of that original song was to match with what I have. And
Right.
going back to that question, what you mentioned about my channel and my covers is that I do put a lot of time and effort in try to make them as unique as I can as far as the sound and just the feel of the song. So yeah, going to live shows, for example, it's also a good way for me to kind of do a little bit of spy work on what they're
Hmm.
playing and
Yeah.
stuff like that. So yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, well, I feel like we could just kind of keep going on things, but yeah, and wrapping it up here, where can people find you online, or is there anything coming up you want to share about, or just where can people come and check out your videos?
I mean, search '90s punk rock covers on YouTube, and you'll find the channel right there. I appreciate, like I said, all the support that I've been getting from a lot of people who have been following me so far. I get tons of good comments. I don't think I've ever gotten like a bad comment yet, which is kind of weird.
I'll give you
And
some.
yeah, like I haven't gotten a troll yet or whatever. Hopefully I don't get one now, but yeah, so find me in YouTube, '90s punk rock covers, and also on Instagram, where I do a little bit more of it's more of a photography portfolio of like gear related. photos and things like that. You can also search in Instagram 90s punk rock covers, and you'll find me there.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks so much, Sam, for making the time to do this. I love getting to hear about different people's stories and upbringings, especially from different parts of North America or the world or whatever. And so yeah. Everyone go check out 90s punk rock videos. It will change your life.
Thanks a lot, man. I'm super stoked to be on the show, and appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and make a new friend. You know what I mean?
Yeah, awesome, cool.
All right, we are going to wrap the show up there. As you heard, that was Aaron sitting down with Sam, a.k.a. 90s Punk Rock Covers, on YouTube. Again, if you want to find us on our social medias, you can find us in a number of places: on Twitter at Growing Punk Pod, on Instagram at Growing Up Punk. Aaron is on Instagram at Aaron Grew Up Punk, and myself, David, on Twitter and Instagram at David Growing Up. And of course, wherever you are listening to this show, please rate it, review it, subscribe, tell your friends about it, and let's talk about our favorite punk records that we grew up listening to. It's as simple as that. Who doesn't like sitting around talking about music? You can talk about music with us on things like YouTube and CastBox or social media as well. Anyway, I'm rambling, so I'm going to get out of here. So bye.